Hi, thank you all so much for being here tonight with us as we raise questions, I hope, and think expansively about the sometimes loaded term portraiture and its possible meanings. How has a portrait traditionally been defined, and what circumstances have prompted its shifts in meaning? What are the stakes of such discussion today? This program is organized on the occasion of an exhibition here at MoMA called Being, which I curated. I'm Lucy Gallun, assistant curator in the Department of Photography here at the museum. And this is the latest iteration of the museum's new photography exhibition series, which was initiated in 1985. Tonight's program comes out of some of the ideas explored in the exhibition, though, as you can see from our absolutely remarkable group of presenters who are working across diverse fields, this will not be a medium-specific discussion limited to photography, but will instead consider wide-ranging approaches to what portraiture can be as realized in multiple formats. I will begin, however, by saying just a few words about the show, as it is the springboard for this program. The exhibition, which is currently on view in our third floor galleries, where it remains through August 19th, considers the variety of ways in which photography might address notions of representation or depictions of personhood today. At a moment when questions about the rights, responsibilities, and dangers inherent in being represented and in representing others are being debated around the world, the works featured in the show call attention to assumptions about how individuals are depicted and perceived. The exhibition includes new works by 17 artists at various stages of their careers, working across the US and internationally, all showing here at the museum for the first time. Though there are certainly works in the exhibition that take on familiar tropes of traditional studio portraiture, for other works on view, it's possible that visitors to the show may not immediately read them as examples of portraiture. In this selection of works by the artist M. Rooney, for example, objects, including photographs, refer to specific people and relationships. She recognizes that printed photographs are often precious things, keepsakes or mementos, and her own prints might be treated as such in unique handmade artist frames or other special presentations, such as the latter on the left of this installation view, which includes small photo keychains hanging from its rungs, each of which includes an image shot by M on a memorable road trip with a close friend. As she says, photographs aren't just flat pieces of paper that exist up against a wall. Photographs are objects, and they're tucked in the corner of the mirror in your bedroom, they're inside your wallet, they're in a locket, shoved in the insides of books, and they're objects that exist in relationship to other objects. Or in Shilpa Gupta's project, which features 100 individuals who have changed their surnames for any number of reasons, whether political, familial, or emotional. A person's surname is, for better or worse, closely tied to how they are identified as an individual. And the surname is an association that individuals must carry with them, but sometimes it becomes a burden. In this work, Gupta represents each person through a framed picture that has been sliced in two. The pieces are positioned near enough to each other that viewers can find and understand the whole image, but they're also read as partial, alluding perhaps to the divided fragments that make up any individual's life. The images themselves are, for the most part, not figurative. Like a name, there are many signs that can refer to a person. The exhibition, of course, is focused on the medium of photography, including the legacy of photographic portraiture, as well as contemporary uses of photography. In the Bay Area artist Stephanie Saihuko's Cargo Cult series, for example, the artist staged images in the style of historical ethnographic portraits, such as on the top left, utilizing her own body clothed in garments and objects that might be read as ethnic or other, though she had purchased them at American chain stores, leaving the tags on to call attention to their status as mass-produced commodities, but also so she could return them after the shoot. Her applicant photos, which also appear in the show, make use of some of these same materials, but here the pattern fabrics completely cover her face, so that besides being read as other, the pictured figure is not physically recognizable. And this simple gesture at once exposes and thwarts the uses of a passport photo, a ubiquitous contemporary portrait format, which is meant to provide a clear, legible view of the sitter's facial characteristics. Nearby Stephanie's work in the exhibition is a video by Palestinian artist Yazan Khalili, which plays on a standard desktop monitor. Over the course of this approximately 8-minute video, the yellow square that we know as an indicator of facial recognition tool on our iPhones attempts to recognize the face of a figure at the center of the composition. Meanwhile, there's also a folder with a long list of JPEG files, each opened one by one, and each of these images depict a mask, maybe photographed in a museum or other display. And those masks, which seem to be drawn from numerous cultures all over the world, when they're opened, that same yellow square appears over each of these as well, trying to recognize the physical facial characteristics of the mask. As viewers of this work, we can't help but think of photography's history in categorizing and classifying people by their physical traits. In thinking about these elements that have been woven into familiar photographic formats, it became apparent that it could be fruitful to expand the discussion, to consider other formats outside this medium, and thus emerged the idea for tonight's program. Of course, I definitely want to mention that there are other exhibitions around the museum that also significantly inform the discussion of portraiture's boundaries. One of those definitely is the astounding and rich retrospective of the work of Adrienne Piper, which is currently on view on the 6th floor, and her work is above. Piper's influential legacy in regards to representations of race and gender, as well as the relationships between a physical and an existential self, cannot be emphasized enough. And pictured here is one example from her key series of the 1970s of her male alter ego, the mythic being. I've also personally just installed an exhibition at MoMA PS1 with the Delhi-based artist Gauri Gill, presenting her newest body of work, Acts of Appearance, a series of color photographs for which she worked closely with members of an Adivasi community in India. This community is renowned for their papier-mâché objects, including traditional sacred masks. For these pictures, Gauri commissioned them to make new masks that instead of portraying usual Hindu or tribal gods and demons, might instead depict living beings drawn from their everyday lives or experiences, with the physical characteristics of humans, animals, or valued objects. And many of her images, as you see here, picture the artists themselves and other volunteer actors from the village interacting with one another, engaged in everyday activities. Often we think of masks as tools that might hide or conceal, but Gill's project underscores how such representations can be as much indicators of their identities as their physical faces would be. Tonight, joining us as moderator for the discussion portrait of this program, we're really fortunate to welcome artist and writer Carmen Winant. Carmen's stunning and ambitious work, My Birth, is currently on view in the exhibition upstairs. Over 2,000 images of women in the process or leading up to birth, in the midst of labor, or its an immediate aftermath, fill 2 facing walls from floor to ceiling, creating a web of relationships and multiple readings between the images. These are all printed materials that she's cut from books and magazines, including those first published in the 1970s, such as Our Bodies, Ourselves. Yet even in our contemporary image-saturated culture, such pictures are not commonly seen, making their overwhelming presence here even more astonishing. In this and her other works, Winant is conscious of the ways the work of women is both visible and invisible. What stories are left out? Which elements of individual experience can images convey, and which aspects are not communicated in the photographic imagery? When thinking about the threads for tonight's program, Carmen and I similarly wanted to consider the amalgam of multiple sources that make up any individual's life, rather than a singular likeness. Before the discussion, we have the pleasure of bringing together 3 extraordinary presenters, each of whom, while working in diverse fields as a curator, a painter, a writer, has taken on or expanded the usual or expected definitions of portraiture and representation in their genres. We'll be hearing from them tonight in reverse alphabetical order, which is the order in which I'll mention them now. And I will not be reading their bios, which together with Carmen's bio, you can read on your own in the programs that have been handed out at the door. First, Louise Stewart is a curator at the National Portrait Gallery in London, where she is the recipient of an Art Fund New Collecting Award to expand the gallery's acquisition program to include objects like popular, global, and ephemeral portraits, objects that would have previously been considered outside their purview. Last spring, while I was in the midst of working on the new photography exhibition, I was struck by announcements in the international art press about this change in the portrait gallery's collecting policy, and thinking about why, at this current moment, such expansion and rethinking felt so vital and compelling. After Louise's presentation, we will hear from painter Amy Sherald, who has become quite a household name these past months after her portrait of Michelle Obama was unveiled at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. During her remarks at that unveiling, Sherald noted that once her paintings are complete, the models no longer exist as themselves. They serve also as archetypes, quote, they become something bigger, more symbolic. And I'm thrilled that we'll have the opportunity to hear more about this approach to representation tonight. And finally, writer Durga Chew-Bose, who is the author of a much celebrated book of essays out last year from FSG Books, Too Much and Not the Mood, the title of which comes from Virginia Woolf's 1931 entry to a writer's diary, in which she described the fatigue of self-editing to craft something pleasing for her readers. Woolf's feeling is evoked in Chew-Bose's writings, which have been celebrated for their idiosyncratic and elegant descriptions of personal relationships, or their warmly considered meld of criticism and memoir, as the New Yorker said. It's also a book that is intimate, even as it's constructed through stories, anecdotes, and characters that are about others. So thank you to Durga, Amy, and Louise for accepting our invitations and joining us for this discussion. Besides tonight's presenters, I also want to express my gratitude to various people who have made this evening possible in various ways. For their support leading up to and around the exhibition itself, I'd really like to take this opportunity to thank all my colleagues in the Department of Photography, especially Quentin Bajac, the Joel and Anne Ehrenkrantz Chief Curator of Photography, for his encouragement. And I'd like to give a special thanks to curatorial intern Evgenia Evstathu for all her help. Major support for the exhibition was provided by the William Randolph Hearst Endowment Fund, by David Deckman and Michelle Mercure, the Robert Mapplethorpe Foundation, and generous funding is also provided by Courtney Finch Taylor and by James Niven. I'm also grateful to my colleagues in the Department of Education for organizing tonight's program and for their openness and excitement about this endeavor to branch from the ideas raised in the exhibition to an even wider view. Pablo, Jess, Adelia, Myrto, and Devin, thank you very much. And finally, I wanted to extend a special thanks to Anna Marie and Bob Shapiro, along with their children, for their generous support of this evening. We are very glad to be here and so glad that you're here with us. And so that leaves it to Louise. Thanks.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, and my thanks go to Lucy and Adelia for extending the invitation to participate and for looking after me so well. So as you know, I am a curator at the National Portrait Gallery in London. Now, the gallery was founded in 1856 with the aim of collecting portraits of people who have made and are making a significant contribution to British history and culture. And that's still the primary criterion which informs our acquisitions policy today. Our collections currently consist of over 340,000 objects, and they date from the 16th century right up to the present, and we do have a contemporary commissioning programme. They mainly consist of paintings, sculpture, works on paper and photographs, but we are currently expanding our definition of portraiture to take account of other types of objects. And that's been aided by a change in our acquisitions policy, which came into effect in 2015. And that allows us to collect objects which shed light on the history of portraiture, as well as those which depict significant sitters. In response to this, in 2017, I applied for a grant from the Art Fund to collect popular, global and ephemeral portraits, and that resulted in a new collecting award to expand the collections in this way. And the aim is to collect portrait objects which were owned, exchanged and displayed by ordinary people from the medieval period right up to the present. And I'm showing you here some of the types of objects that I hope to acquire, and some of which we're currently in the process of acquiring. And the project will look at a whole range of functions for these portrait objects, including memorialization. So, for example, you can see the bronze head of a lady, which would have provided a memorial to her in a church. Celebrity and propaganda. So you can see at the top left a dish which was created to commemorate a royal wedding and drum up support for the monarchy, quite similar to the Harry and Meghan Markle material that seems to be cropping up everywhere at the moment. And other functions, such as advertising, are included as well. So you can see here a railway poster encouraging us to visit Canterbury and using a portrait of Elizabeth I. And what I hope to achieve through this project is to demonstrate the impact of portraiture on everyday life, the ways in which we are and have historically been constantly surrounded by portraits, and how they have a really important impact on our everyday visual experiences. And hopefully, these objects will be highly appealing and relevant for our visitors. I imagine that they might even recognise some of them as objects that they've seen in homes or in the street. And this evening, I just wanted to talk in a little bit more detail about some of the types of objects that I'll be collecting with this funding that the gallery wouldn't have actively sought out before, and to explain their impact on our collections. So the project has a pre-1500 focus. Now, painted portraiture was only introduced to Britain in around 1500, so our earliest collection objects date from that period. So the project investigates the ways in which identity was understood and expressed prior to the advent of painted portraiture. And that's done through objects like this. So this is a brooch which was dug up in a field in Surrey in 2015. The central panel is made of glass, and surrounding it is copper alloy, which has been gilded to look like gold. These aren't very precious materials. It's not an incredibly high status object. It dates from well before painted portraiture arrived in Britain, so around 950 to 1100 AD is as close as I can get to a specific date. And you can see that the central panel features a human face, and it seems to be wearing some form of crown or diadem. The sitter's unidentified, and it's unlikely that we'll ever know who it was intended to represent. So that's a real departure for us at the National Portrait Gallery. It could represent a king, but this might also be a saint or a mythological figure. And what is particularly interesting to me about this object is that it's not intended to provide a faithful physical likeness of the person that it represents. And I think whether a portrait needs to do this is a really important question that I'm sure we'll come back to later. But at this date, pre-1500, physical likeness is not what people are interested in at all when they think about identity or when they make portraits. They're much more concerned with using imagery like this to signify authority. So this is an image about the status, about the spiritual or worldly power of the depicted figure. That's what's important, not what they look like. Now, at this date, people wore images of saints to identify themselves as Christians, or images of powerful people like kings to demonstrate their loyalty to those people. And in this way, I think the brooch, when it was worn on a garment, acted much more as a portrait of the wearer than the person that's depicted in the central panel here. It would have made a really clear statement about the wearer's identity, either as a Christian or as loyal to whoever it is that's depicted here. As well as investigating the prehistory of portraiture, this project also allows us to collect representations of sitters who have traditionally been underrepresented within the historical collections, including women and non-white sitters. And we struggle to find portraits of women and non-white sitters before the 20th century. And here I'm showing you two objects which the gallery is in the process of acquiring. On the left, you can see an image of Ellen Bright, the Lion Queen. She was a lion tamer who was killed by a tiger whilst performing in London in 1850, aged 17. Her death caused a sensation. It was reported in all the London newspapers, accompanied by illustrations. And it eventually resulted in the banning of female lion tamers. On the right, you can see a figurine of Billy Waters. Now, he'd lost a leg serving in His Majesty's forces, possibly in the Royal Navy, after which he earned his living playing the fiddle as a street entertainer. His obituary notes that he died in poverty shortly after having been forced to pawn his fiddle and enter the workhouse. But despite this, he was such a well-known figure within London that he featured in a book and an opera during his lifetime as a character. Now, these types of ceramic figurines were incredibly popular in the 19th century. They featured contemporary celebrities and were displayed on mantelpieces in ordinary working or middle-class homes. So they represent a really important form in which ordinary people had daily contact with portraits. Although today, in many ways, they are really troubling objects, you could argue that they were much more significant and impacted more people than the fine art portraits that we have traditionally collected. And again, they're important for our collection because they are the types of people that we historically find it really difficult to represent. So women, working classes, and non-white sitters, people who didn't have their portraits painted but were represented in different ways. The global portraiture strand of the project aims to explore the issue of empire and Britain's colonial past from the point of view of colonised nations. And on the left here, you can see a carved bust of Queen Victoria, which was created in Nigeria. And these busts are quite common, and I'm very much hoping that I'll be able to acquire one. They were based on photographs of the Queen, which were distributed in 1887 and 1897 to mark her golden and diamond jubilees, so 50 and 60 years on the throne, respectively. And those photographs, and you can see an example here on the right, were displayed in the offices of colonial administrators, and they were often given as gifts to local rulers. So they had a fairly wide impact. In the sculpture here, you can see that Victoria's likeness, whilst it's based on the photograph, has been adapted to reflect local style. So the enlargement of the head is typical of Yoruba sculpture, and it represents the wisdom and serenity of the subject. What we have here is an example of exchange between British and non-British portrait practice, illustrating the global impact of British sitters, be that positive or negative, and the ways in which they have been appropriated by other cultures. This new expanded approach to portraiture is significant in shedding new light on the history of portraiture and its impact beyond the walls of palaces and art galleries. Through it, we can focus our attention on the types of portraits that ordinary people made or commissioned, purchased, brought into their homes, or handled on a daily basis and still continue to do. And through further research, I hope to uncover some of the attitudes and motivations of the people who owned and displayed these objects. So what factors, for example, contributed to the choice and location of portraits displayed within people's homes? Equally significantly, expanding our definition of portraiture allows us to tell the stories of people who have played an important part in British history, but who've often been overlooked when those histories were written down. So women, the working classes, non-white sitters, artists from other cultures, and to some extent, I hope, the unnamed people who owned the objects that I've shown you today. Through these portraits, I hope to make the National Portrait Gallery's collections a bit more representative of Britain as a nation, both historically and today. Thank you.
Hey, y'all. So I'm starting with this photograph. I usually start all of my talks with this photograph. My sister is not adopted, just so you know. But I start with this photograph because in a lot of ways, when I look at it, I realized how my existence had already been codified through language, through imagery. I was already covered with words and labels and seemingly a long list of limitations based on my race and my gender. I was being taught how to live, how to think, and what words to think in, what to worship, and to do so within a certain framework. And the performance of who I was and the experiences of who I was supposed to be were already set in motion. And I like to call it the narrowing of my imagination. So when I was a child, I spent hours looking at photographs of my family. It was something that I did on slow days. We only had 2 or 3 television stations on TV. So I would usually find my way to this cabinet where we had all of our family photographs. And I spent a lot of time looking at this image of my grandmother. Her name was Jewel. I never got to meet her, and this is the only photograph we had of her. And these kinds of photographs have always captivated me because of their aesthetic, but also because of the narrative that they employed. They're part of a self-authored historical narrative, and they have become symbolic in ways that I think allows them to be employed as archetypes. I also spent much of my downtime thumbing through books that my parents had on their shelves. We had encyclopedias. And this is what art was to me at that time. It was all I had been exposed to. I didn't pay as much attention to the composition itself when I was looking at these kinds of paintings, but as to how well everything was rendered, the fingers, the faces in the painting. I don't think I quite realized what the composition was about at that age. But for me, everything changed after I walked into a museum and saw this painting by the artist Beau Bartlett. I was on an elementary school field trip and remember stopping in my tracks because it was the first time I had seen a modern painting. Beau had painted himself as a Black man. And this changed every notion that I had about what art was, and it became more accessible to me and accessible to my imagination. And I saw my reflection in this piece. The painting is called Object Permanence. And this image had a great effect on me because it was the first time I had seen anything that was different than the images of the old masters that I grew up looking at in the encyclopedias. So when I moved on to painting, we're going to fast forward 25 years or so. And this painting is called The Light in Her is Easy to Love. So when I began to paint the work that I've now become known for, I realized that I had come to have a certain aesthetic. And that was a great part of shaping my aesthetic, was looking at those older photographs. And my vision comes from those photographs and what they have become to mean to me as I reach back to connect to my childhood narrative. So I continued to do visual research once I started to make these paintings. I decided to look at photography, and I looked at the history of photography, how the camera obscure had altered the idea of painting in some ways. I also became fascinated with the dignified daguerreotypes and photographs of Black families, soldiers, women, men, and children. And so while doing this research, I found this photograph that's on the right. And I had already completed this painting of the name of it is The Rabbit in the Hat. And I saw a connection between the two images. I realized that I had basically made the same painting as the photograph have never seen the photographs. And so this image is from W. Du Bois's exhibition in 1902. He had an exhibition of about 363 photographs, and they were of Georgia Negroes, and it was about representing Black people to the world. And here we have an image of Frederick Douglass. Douglass and Du Bois took advantage of the invention of the camera and employed it specifically to change the way Black people were seen. He engaged the politics of representation through photographic images. His images were more than just vanity sittings. He used the camera in a way that countered the weaponizing of photography, which had been used as a tool to argue racial hierarchy. And Douglass was photographed 160 times, and he considered photography crucial in the quest to end slavery and to achieve civil rights. He created a visual legacy with Daguerre's invention. He said that the humblest servant girl may now possess a picture of herself such as the wealth of kings could not purchase 50 years ago. Photography had become a tool that dignified the poorest of the poor. It was a potent equalizer. He went so far as to say the moral and social influence of pictures was more important in shaping national culture than making laws. And so I began to look at portraiture through the lens of photography. I consider my paintings to be a meditation on photography. It offered me another way to see portraiture beyond the reign of European paintings, because when the camera was invented, so was the opportunity for us to become the authors of our own narratives in a way that we had never been able to before. And these are some of the images from that exhibition. So there's a marriage between creativity and history. Photography was used as a political effort to reshape the understanding of the African American, not only by white people, but and white and European audiences, but for African Americans themselves. These images are about respectability politics. And although we're being ourselves, it is still a kind of performance of respectability. These were representational systems in action. These images to me were a solid evidence of existing in, or being a part of a history that connected me to a past that was love. So these images document Black life in the same vein that traditional portrait paintings of white aristocracy serve to trace social and cultural histories. Absent from those orthodox lineages, Black families and individuals exercise photography as an organic, immediate means of attaining personal and ultimately political agency. At the turn of the century, Du Bois compiled, oh wait, I already said that. These photographs, okay. So photography became a vernacular language capturing people in their immediacy. So I began to connect these photographs and daguerreotypes along with snapshots of African Americans in everyday life with paintings. Moving into a similar but different language, they have become symbolic to me of a history of American Blacks that were not rendered in paint, but through intimate and vibrant photographs. These images were collected by my colleague on the right, a friend of mine, Jeanne. He collected these for a project that he calls Fade Resistance. And these are all orphaned photographs. He imagined these photos to have been precious keepsakes, at least to the people that they belonged to. Long before it became fashionable to tweet, Instagram, or snap our own carefully staged reality with selfie sticks and flattering filters, these families empowered themselves with Polaroids to curate their own lives. Buying the photos at yard sales and on eBay, Lee has prevented them from ending up in the waste of visual history. So for me, these photographs have started to become a way to reclaim time within art history. So we all know who this is. And I wanted to talk about this photograph. When we think about presidential and first lady portraits, they are already imbued with dignity from the outset. It is a vocabulary that has been fixed, but this portrait holds a different kind of symbolism, and therefore transcends beyond the personality of our former First Lady Queen. She sits as an archetype. And I just wanted to read, in closing, a paragraph from Elizabeth Alexander's book. It's called The Black Interior. She was selected by Barack Obama for his 2009 inauguration as a poet. She writes, African American people are seen, imagined, and known through sociological and fantasy discourses. But the troves of our culture offer enlightening angles of vision. The artist can offer deeply informed imaginings that offers one of the only routes we may have to imagine a past whose records have not been kept precious. Tapping into the Black imaginary helps us to envision what we are not meant to claim. Complex Black selves, real and inactable Black power, rampant and unfetishized Black beauty. So this portrait of the First Lady pauses at a site of contradiction, where Black creativity complicates and resists what Blackness is supposed to be, just as photography has done and continues to do. And that's what I have for you tonight.
So I obviously don't have any visuals. What interests me is portraiture that reveals the simultaneous, that which doesn't confirm but conjures, creating the impression of rendezvous. I prefer when a photograph rejects the illusion of stillness in favor of a spookier, more defiant kind of motion. What's coincident? We characterize film as moving images, but what is it about a photograph that simulates motion, that agitates, photographs that follow some strange law, not of attraction necessarily, but recurrence? What is it about a face that lingers, that leaves me feeling sort of spun out? While it might sound irrational, these are the questions I hope to never answer, because getting to the bottom of what haunts me is a great nagging fear of mine, and obeying the tangled order of what startles me, like a photograph of a stranger I might feel previously acquainted with, I know her, I'll think, is the very essence of the work. Without these provocations, as far as I'm concerned, there is no work. Tolerating the wonderfully troubling nature of a photograph, a smile that feels off, a face that's flush and true, or a face half concealed, or a parent so young she looks, I can't explain why, like a missing person, is what Joy Williams describes as the writer's responsibility to signs and dreams. If you don't do anything with it, says Williams, you lose it. You stop getting these omens. You stop seeing, as I see it, the strange, unnerving potential of a photograph and begin referring to it merely as document. So I've chosen 3 photographs, 3 that I keep near, and I have a few things to tell you about them. But I won't show you these photographs, and sometimes I think it's nice to just rest our eyes. So these are 3 photographs that I return to repeatedly, sort of like a book that you might return to on your bookshelf, what Virginia Woolf described in reference to her own library and the books that she returns to as another sip of the divine specific. So first, a photograph of 2 sisters in 1923, the Hungarian-British Indian painter Amrita Shergill and her sister Indira. In the photo, Amrita is 10 years old. 18 years later, in 1941, she dies, 28 years young. But in this photo, she is 10, looking old, thick brows, petal lips, unsmiling. The 2 girls are dressed up. They are wearing hats, headpieces. Both sisters are draped in scarves, a shawl, and the ornamenting strangeness, the costumeness of adult stuff, like the low hang of a necklace on child ratios. Child torsos. In this photograph, the colors are various shades of seashell, silvered peach, pink, mint, orange, like the scales of a fish or a mermaid. Mermaid, too, because the girls look misunderstood. Their stares are somehow submerged, grown, the sort of stare my friend Doreen characterizes as having been here before. And isn't it true that those who depart us early seem not merely possessed, no, that would be too simple a reading, but kept at a distance as though talent of this kind, of Amrita's luminous, preoccupied kind, reveals itself young because the girl is often born old. The second photograph is of another set of sisters, the Chew sisters in Calcutta, and their mother, Dulcie, my grandmother. My aunt Jennifer, the eldest, the middle, Lois, the third, my mother, Dolores. But what's particular about this photo is its construction, is its mistake. It's a double exposure, ghostly overlaid. Technically speaking, a double exposure is sensitive to light and time and sudden movements. And the only person who's caught moving who isn't hummingbird-like is my mother, the youngest, the most restless, her skinny ankles doubled, her face twice. I've never seen video documentation of my mother when she was young. We have photo albums, plenty, wallet-sized glimpses of her mischief illustrated to great effect from stories I've been told. But this photograph, which I framed and where it hangs in my living room, might be the only proof I have, or impression rather, of my mother as a girl in motion. The lack of opacity creates the fantasy of sound, like the bottoms of her white Mary Janes impatiently scratching concrete as she tries to hold a pose, or the full potential of her sudden moves and giggles, wide, communicable, all gums. When I stare at this photograph, I perceive what might have been one of the last moments of pure restlessness, her life, that is, before her first stillness. 6 or so years later, Dulcie died. When I ask my mother how she felt that night so long ago when she was only 14, she rarely says much. Still, she always makes note of the sky. It was a full moon, my mother will say, as if clarifying the details of events not as document, but carefully and tenderly with deference for her memory. Finally, the third photograph. It's of the poet Frank O'Hara, taken by the art critic John Gruen in 1961. This photograph is imperfect and intimate. He is 35. He would die 5 years later. There's very little to say about the photograph's light, its composition or contrast. There's a tree in the background. Maybe Frank was photographed by John on Long Island. Maybe de Kooning or Marisol or Rauschenberg or Jasper Johns were there, not far, just out of frame. With Frank, I always imagined there was someone, a friend, just out of frame. With Frank, there is always something vaguely nostalgic, incandescent about his smile. It's barely a smile, somehow uncooperative and dazed, caught. But what I love most and what knocks me out and makes me grin like a fool is this, tucked just inside his mouth, hardly visible, are Frank O'Hara's two front teeth. Two little teeth. And I don't know why, and maybe it has something to do with what I imagine Frank might have noticed, might have gently deliberated on for a person or a lover in his life or an old friend. Or maybe it is that little teeth are not the stuff of photographs of famous writers and more the stuff of vacation photographs shared only between friends when the days were stretched long, when everyone smoked and smoked. Because for whatever reason, I think of cigarettes when I think of little teeth. I think of tobacco caught in little teeth. He once said of Helen Frankenthaler that one of her strengths was the very ability to risk everything on inspiration. And the same could be said about him. And the same could be said about anyone reading him. He makes you want to risk everything on first love and old love, the details of a painting, a statue, or what we were like then when we were still first rate and the day came fat with an apple in its mouth. He makes you want to risk everything on little teeth. Thank you.
So I guess I'm the only person who has not yet been up here. I'm Carmen Winant, and along with Lucy, we will be leading about a 30-minute discussion with, as Lucy said, these extraordinary panelists, and then there'll be about 15 minutes after that for questions, and I hope that you do have questions. So I've been taking notes as you all have been talking, and I have various things written down from questions of visibility and urgency to dignity, class, and questions of loss and grief. So it's quite sort of a span there. We'll see how much we can cover. I wanted to start with a question that sort of concerns me, perhaps the bluntest and most jagged place to start, which is, what is a portrait? Or maybe a better way to ask that question is, what is not a portrait? And do we need, in fact, to have a boundary or qualifiers between what is and what is not? And I think that that could be answered in any number of ways by, any number of you folks. So please, whomever would like to take a stab at it.
Well, I suppose the way that the Portrait Gallery in London has traditionally defined a portrait is a representation of an individual. But I also think it's really interesting to think about portraits representing all sorts of other things like places and times. And I think that's something that it would be really interesting to see the gallery explore a little bit. But I'm quite relaxed about the definition of a portrait, actually. I think we should be kind of pushing at it.
I mean, I agree. Is my microphone on? Yes. No, I agree, and I think as a portrait artist, my definition is constantly expanding because I learned to paint, and that's so traditional. I think it was difficult for me at first to think about it in any other way, but the deeper I get into my practice, the more I realize that it's there to communicate many different kinds of things in many different ways and many different kinds of practices. And for me, I'm really appreciating performance art as a kind of portraiture right now, and there's some programming that the National Portrait Gallery in DC has been doing with that. So I'm being opened up as we speak, put it that way.
In terms of writing, I see portraiture right now with friends and colleagues who are writers who
I sort of perceive them recreating the form based on what they notice. Everyone's kind of always writing about the same thing or the same person, it sometimes feels like, but if the writer has a particular angle or a voice or a sense of humor or is kind of like more sneaky, it's a new form of portraiture.
And can a portrait be absent a person? Need I clarify that? Right.
You mean be about an object? Or
Sure. Or I was thinking as Durga was speaking of how you were relating to those photographs in some sense as objects more than as people, right? Or more than as of the people that they depict. I've been thinking a lot about this in my own work and how sort of what could be a surrogate for a body, say.
But in that way, the surrogate for the body is still there in place of the body. So, you know, some of the examples I showed from the exhibition and came up in a way of how photographs have served for various practices. They still existed even in their absence, and they still, the kind of aura or memory of that representation is still present in the finished portrait. Yeah.
It's not something I know the answer to.
Yeah.
That's why I put it out there, right?
I mean, I think it's important. I mean, for me, I think it becomes a portrait when it has a narrative, right? And I guess it has to be connected to a story, so you don't necessarily have to have a person, but I think it can be a portrait if it's words about something, you know, that is specific.
I also sort of see it like an organization of things in terms of people have unofficial altars in their homes of how they keep a home. And there's portraiture in that as far as I'm concerned, like walking into someone's home and seeing how they organize themselves and how they keep things just so, for me, feels like a version of portraiture and definitely has innate to that narrative. So yeah, I definitely see the relationship with objects for sure.
It's a question I think that pertains to this recent essay written by Dushko Petrovich, which maybe some of you read, and then T Magazine came out about a month ago, maybe a little over a month ago, about the sort of resurgence and popularity of portraiture, particularly of portrait painting. And Dushko was making the argument, reductively, was making the argument along two lines. One, I think that, as Amy is pointing out, well, as Amy and Louise are pointing out, there's a question of visibility. Who can we make visible that was invisible through portraiture, and how can we sort of elevate the status of persons who have been marginalized? And two, the sort of undeniability of portraiture, right? There's nothing, in some way, there's nothing abstract about it. So I want to talk a little bit about the urgency of portraiture. And perhaps the way I can pose this question is, are there some bodies that are more urgent than others? And has portraiture become an inherently political tactic?
I think because we actively commission portraits at the National Portrait Gallery. And so, yeah, the question of what is achievement, whose achievements do we honour, who gets to choose who we commission portraits of, I think it's just inherently political, and yeah, there's no getting away from that, and it's contentious. And we invite the public to nominate people, but you know, there's still a boardroom situation where actually the decisions get made, rightly or wrongly.
Anyone else care to touch on that? I mean, it's maybe even too big of a topic just to broach, but we'd be remiss not to talk about it at all, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, speaking for my practice and the things that I'm interested in, it's because the Black body has always been political. I think the presentation of it goes beyond just it's just a photograph of a person. It's always serving a purpose. And when it's placed inside of museum institutions where it becomes a critique of a certain kind of narrative, then it is a political, I mean, I think as a curator, it could become a political act to bring these, to just diversify those kinds of spaces.
I think also who gets to tell these stories, and if it's anything from an institution or some kind of like legacy publication, I feel like something that's inherently political is when attention is given and opportunities are given to artists who aren't necessarily seen as having perfected their craft or honed it, but are asking questions and are figuring it out and working through it, and being given the space to do that carefully and with respect and guidance is also, it feels like a pretty radical act for me too, like allowing the space for those who aren't yet at a certain point in their career or don't even know what they want to share yet but are working through it. I think that feels inherently political to me.
Right. It's interesting because on one hand, as you all were just answering with the last question, there's this interest, at least for me, in how a portrait can exist without a body, and this idea, as Lucy was pointing to, around absence and the imprint of a person. And on the other hand, there's a real necessity to put the body in the picture, right? To put a certain kind of body in the picture. So for me, that's a real tension and problem, and I mean problem in the best way, for how portraiture exists now, both, I mean, across all of your disciplines, I would say. I want to move sort of sideways from there to talking about this question of dignity. It was a word that came up in your presentation, Amy, and it's something that I think about a lot in maybe a clumsy way in relationship to why we make portraits and how we sort of ingest portraits of others. Is sort of how do we think about dignity operating within portraiture? Is that an important part of what you do? And perhaps this is maybe too related to the last question, but I didn't want to breeze over it.
So what was the question?
Bluntly put, how do you think about dignity operating in your work in relationship to the likes and wants of portraiture?
It matters greatly to me because it, again, like what I said in my presentation is that, it becomes a critique to the art historical narrative. Representation has been something that I think people that look like me have been struggling with for decades and decades. So for me, it becomes about representing these images to people that have never seen images like that before. So I get, a lot of people. I mean, this is a crazy story, but like some people have never even really been around other people besides themselves. And so for me, having my work inside of the museum institution is a way for me to kind of counter those narratives that they may have, because my imagery, I like to say that I produce it in a way that's universal, which is why I don't deal with complexion, because it offers a softer kind of entering into the subconscious, and it allows people to internalize what they're looking in a different way. So it doesn't, so I'm kind of stepping away from the being othered, if you will. And so, and again, like, these are the images that I grew up looking at. And so, what you learn in school was very different than the images that I had and the daguerreotypes that I came across, because I had never seen those before, up until, I don't know, I guess it was 20 years ago or something like that. And so to know that I had a history that was connected to love, and then to make images, to make the type of images that I make, so there are places that people can come and rest their eyes. You can walk into a museum space and see somebody that looks like yourself and then receive love from that image. Dignity is important. Mm-hmm.
I think there's also a way to dignify a person or a family that is
just based on the people's limited frame of references, they're so easily stereotyped. And something that I try to push up against is just because I might identify as first generation or the children of immigrants, it doesn't mean my tastes are going to be what's obvious to others. And I always try to push that. I try to kind of challenge people's frame of reference by sharing my own references too. They're not obviously going to be necessarily always welcome, but I think it's really nice when you can kind of surprise your reader by providing something outside of, like, Amrita Shergill is a perfect example, because I was telling Amy before that people love to call her the Frida Kahlo of India, and it's such a narrow way of describing her, but it makes her immediately accessible, and I'm actually not interested in anything that's immediately accessible. I want people to feel uncomfortable and surprised and sometimes even ambushed by something, and so if you need to simplify it for a wider frame of reference, especially in portraiture, that doesn't interest me at all.
And I think the issue of dignity is really pertinent to those two figurines that I showed, which I described as troubling objects. And I didn't really go into that because I didn't have time, but they're both posthumous images. They're both made after these people have died, and both of them quite horrible circumstances. And with the Ellen Bright figurine, it's an image of her being mauled by a tiger, and that's how she died. And there's this kind of very uncomfortable, for me, sense of sort of voyeuristic pleasure in her death. So I think there's a real question about, there's no other way to represent her because, well, I mean, there could be if you thought about it creatively, but do we acquire the figurine? Do I put that on display? And how do you interpret that? And I think it's about contextualizing it and interpreting it in quite a sensitive way. With the Billy Waters figurine, again, a posthumous image, it needs to be interpreted really sensitively, but also they were produced in multiples, and there's actually a choice of different models with Billy Waters, and the one that I've been able to acquire is actually it's the most sympathetic likeness. So there is a certain element of, I think, just being really, really conscious of that, but also we'll probably do things like using contemporary voices in the interpretation to try and get a more sort of well-rounded sense of who the individual was and what they meant to different people. And I really do want to research what people were doing with these figurines in their homes, because I'm not sure, and I don't think anyone else is. I don't think that research has been done. So I'd love to find some contemporary accounts of why people were interested.
I'm glad you point that out, because I really mean dignity dignity and indignity, I guess I should clarify, right? That image of Frederick Douglass is so powerful for the reasons that you pointed out, Amy, and at the same moment I think about all the ways in which photography has been used to strip dignity from people, and not photography, portraiture. It's been used to strip dignity from people, or in the case of my own family, how photographs don't exist because they were wiped out in the Holocaust, right? Or that they weren't able to sort of move with those pictures across time and place, and sort of all the shame that attends that. So I'm interested in this unanswerable question and problem again, which maybe brings me to this thing that you mentioned, Durga. My fear in approaching the portrait is that it does fix something, at least so as I've understood it, right? It's a finished project of a person, and a person themselves can never be a finished project. So I wonder how you and everyone here thinks about that issue, or maybe you disagree.
Yeah, I mean, the photographs that I chose for that reason, they felt like, well, there are three people who are obviously also dead, and so there's like all this room for the viewer to think about that in and of itself, I think. But I don't necessarily think there are a lot of virtues in complete certainty, but I also don't think that portraiture limits one either, because, like I was saying earlier, depending on, at least with writing, who is doing the writing, they're providing something that keeps one very open. I think Frank O'Hara, as a poet, his entire project was about being open, heart open, being prone to feeling like nothing is certain. With him and Amrita Shergill, they died so young, so you also have no idea what they could have potentially even achieved. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like as long as there's an audience, there's room for the dialogue and the discourse, and which, you know, makes it even more important that these works get seen and shared. So there is that dialogue, and then people pass it on. I know one of my least favorite chapters in any biography, you know, especially it happens with filmmakers, where they end with unfinished works. And I'm never sure if that should be there, if the filmmakers would have wanted it. But sometimes I think it's actually a very hopeful way to end someone's biography, the projects they had planned to work on. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah.
It's also very similar to the construction of your very beautiful and evocative text, where when you talked about each image, you also talked about how long after that image was taken the person died, which served kind of multiple purposes. I think it served to show us that they had died young, as you said, but also it did point out that maybe there had been some shifts or other changes in context between when, like, that image was literally fixed as a photograph, and then our feelings around looking at it now and what meanings it might have now, and standing in for that person that has passed.
I was also struck by that. One of the earliest portraits I remember seeing as a kid was at my own grandfather's memorial, right? And how so often there's either a painting or a photograph of that person, which is, in fact, the sort of the earliest, where we can trace the earliest history of the portrait as a funeral or a funerary object. This is maybe too, like, macabre of a question then, but is there sort of a relationship to death and to loss and to grief in how you all think about portrait making and portrait sort of reception?
I think the portrait is just inherently bound up with death. To make a portrait is to acknowledge that at some point the subject of the portrait will not be there, and that the portrait will become the substitute for the subject. So yeah, I think you just can't get away from it. As you say, it's one of the earliest functions of portraiture, and I think it's just as relevant today because, you know, we all have photograph albums in our homes of relatives who are no longer here. And yes, it's just such an important function.
I mean, I think for me, I don't think of it that way because I guess I kind of don't consider my paintings portraiture. They're more, I mean, you know, like I said at the unveiling, it's like once they're finished, you know, when I looked at that image, I wasn't seeing the little girl that I asked if I could paint. You know, I don't connect her name with the image. It becomes something bigger than that because it's about the absence of something, and so I don't connect it with death or that.
Can I keep going? Okay. So maybe I'll end with this last question. I'm trying to remember now. I think maybe it was Amy who mentioned the sort of proliferation of images and portrait and self-portrait making that we're living inside of. I've been thinking a lot about the way in which portraiture's relationship to class has been shifting, class and status. Anyone can portrait make, right? How does that factor into the work that you do? Are you excited by that? Are you disturbed by it? Are you confused by it? Does it sort of change or imprint upon how you practice?
I mean, not for me. I mean, I paint everyday people. I work from photographs. But what's happening on Instagram has nothing to do with what I do, I don't think. I mean, it's, people have a way of representing themselves, and I'm sure that somehow finds its way into my subconscious, but I see what I do is completely separate from all that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of mass proliferation of images will impact on the work that artists are producing, but also I think as curators we have to acknowledge this new visual world that we're living in. So I am quite interested in looking at ways that we can make that present within the National Portrait Gallery, but I don't know if it serves those images to have them next to the historic portraits. But I think it is really interesting to bring in kind of self-generated visitor images, and we've done that digitally quite a lot. So yeah, I think absolutely, if we want to, as curators, exist in the real world and make what we do relevant, then yeah, we've got to acknowledge it.
It's an interesting way. Maybe it's a good place for us to end, because sort of brings us back full circle to this question, the sort of dialectic of presence and absence in portrait making. At least as I think of social media, sort of Instagram life and presence, it's about like affirming, right? Like, I'm here, you're here, we're all here. If you didn't take a picture of it, it didn't happen. Like this sort of, over proliferation of making pictures, which stands, I think, sort of for me on the sort of the opposite end of sort of thinking through the terms of absence and a person existing in a portrait through not being there in some way. So maybe we could, that's rather open-ended, I know, but maybe we could leave it there and open it up for questions, unless, Lucy, you wanted to add anything to that.
No, well, sure. Two things that, one, thinking about Louise's project and the efforts behind that in a broader sense, how many things that we didn't consider for a long time part of this definition of portraiture then can be very productive to think of in that context, including things that were not made by people that considered them maybe even portraits in that closed sense. And then also tonight, I was really struck with how, I said it in my introductory remarks that I was hoping to go beyond the medium-specific discussion and invited people from very diverse fields to come speak about what portraiture could be, and we ended up talking a lot about photographs, and maybe that's something indicative of what I am looking at in their work, but I think is also something that we as curators that work with photography should be really conscious of in thinking about how photographs do serve, how they aren't just the photographic print on the wall, and in what ways they circulate in all kinds of formats. And I hadn't intended that to come out, but it did. So yeah, let's open it up to the audience. Are there any questions out there? What? There must be. Okay, I see one in the middle on the sort of left here. Wait, there's going to be a mic, actually. Yeah.
Okay. This is for all of you, but I'm wondering how you feel about if portraits should be objective, or if artists can make portraits that are critical or complimentary about their subjects.
I think we find when we commission portraits that artists will tend to take the commission on when they feel that they have some kind of affinity or sympathy with the subject. So I think there's a certain element. I mean, Amy, this is probably more your area, but would you paint a portrait of someone that you were very critical? Yeah, exactly.
No. No. I mean, I'm very picky about who I paint, and I've said no to a lot of people. So, I mean, but there's a lot of people that, I think the portrait of Bill Clinton was made by the artist, and the artist did not like Bill Clinton because he said that he hit on his wife. And so he purposely, I forgot what he put something in the painting, but he also made him look like Ted Koppel. And when Bill and Hillary saw it, they were like, absolutely not. And that's why Chuck Close's painting is hanging in the National Portrait Gallery. I mean, so there's people out there that will do that, but I guess it's just not my thing. It's just more of a romantic experience for me, I guess.
I also think, I mean, Amy and I both spoke about grandmothers. I think the mother, in some ways, is for a lot of people the first portrait. I don't know, like the imagery in the house or watching one's mother just do anything in some ways can inform that. And that, for me, comes from love and respect and is not objective at all, And that's, for me, how I all the writers that I love, they, even if they're writing about other people, they always make sure to describe who the subject's parents are and what their jobs were and what they did. And so for me, that has to come from care to put that work in. And so I don't really think there's much room for objectivity in that sense.
Come on, y'all.
Hi, this one's for Amy. So you made a pretty big gap between photographing everyday people and then photographing one of the most iconic female figures of our time. After painting Michelle, where do you sort of go from there? How are you going to look at your subjects differently or choose your subjects differently? And has this changed who you would like to paint or who you would aspire to paint?
No, I get asked that question a lot, and I hate to disappoint y'all. But it really didn't change anything. I mean, I paint everyday people, and I feel like Michelle fit right into the manifesto that my images, of how they live in the world. And so, it's a continuation of that narrative. I've been asked to paint other people that I've turned down, and but she's no different. I mean, I paint Black people doing everyday things, and she was a Black woman. She just happened to become the first lady. But she's part of a narrative that I pushed out there of just us being us and doing what we do. And I think, I make the paintings that I make because there was a lack of that narrative within the American art canon. So when I looked at images, I didn't see those images. So for me, it's all the same.
This question is more specifically for Durga and Amy. You guys often paint or portray people that you know, sometimes people that you know intimately, and in the case of Michelle, somebody who's really important. Mm-hmm. How much does that affect the way that you are capturing a person? Durga, you write a lot about your friends. Do you ever think about, I'm afraid of what they're going to think about the way that I write about them? Or were you afraid of Michelle's did that affect the way that you painted her, I guess, your outside opinion? Because these are living people. These aren't people who have passed away.
The first thing that I did when I found out that I was going to paint her was I went online and I looked at the millions of photographs that are out there of her, and I think I immediately decided that I needed it to be something that was a lot more personal, because she has an image that exists in the world and a kind of performance, and not saying that she's not authentic, but she has a way of being. And as a portrait painter, I think you have the ability to capture something that is deeper in the interior of who the person is. And so that's what I was going for. And I think maybe that's why people thought it was unrecognizable, because they had never seen that side of her, but it was who showed up to the to the painting, like it's who she was that day. And so that's who I captured. So I thought about it in that way. I mean, and there's, obviously for a short time I thought about what everybody else would think about what I was doing, but I kind of let that go.
Yeah, I definitely think about it all the time. I feel particularly lucky that my friends are incredibly brilliant and articulate people. So quoting them or kind of being inspired by them is almost unavoidable. I have spoken to friends before using something to kind of almost like fact check, which is very important, the exchange. But yeah, I mean, it's like their brilliance feels incandescent, and it feels like their turns of phrase are super original and theirs. And I feel just as lucky to know them, but to share that with more people. It is a concern, but it's kind of like the sort of concern you have with family. It comes from love and tenderness. It doesn't come from fear.
Thank you. This has just been an awesome and inspiring moment and sharing. So thank you, first of all, to the panel.
Hey, Candace.
Hi. You're brilliant. It was. I wanted to ask you all. Well, I guess Durga and Amy, with you talking so much about other media that inspire you, and with the sort of ever expanding notion of the portrait. Do you ever want to dip into other formats, other media, video, or with technology, we constantly have other ways to expand whatever we're doing. Does that pique your curiosity?
Yes, very much so. Mainly because I think that what I love the most is feeling sort of blind in a room, not really sure. I mean, even being invited here, I was like, "Are you sure?" I don't think I do portraiture. So, but you say yes, and then you're on this panel, right? And so, for me, it's more like a new medium is a new opportunity to feel kind of powerlessly lost, and in that, figure something out. So, for that reason, yes, for sure.
I have two. I thought about video portraiture in a way, just quiet stills of people just being still, but capturing them for, I don't know, a whole minute, where the camera is just on their faces and they're just there and they're breathing and they're blinking. But I'm not sure whether or not it would kind of perpetuate the same energy that I think that I'm able to kind of harness and put out through the paintings. But yeah, I mean, I've always wanted Wes Anderson to make a movie with all the people that I've painted, and that wouldn't exactly be like a portrait, but I mean that would like make me really happy.
Oh, sorry. I was just wondering. I thought the idea of you talked about kind of the place be a portrait, and I was wondering for Amy or Durga or anyone who kind of creates, like, what goes into, obviously not just the portrait of the person, but what goes into creating the background, whether it's background details or why did you choose blue for the portrait of Michelle, or a pattern for some of the things that you showed up there, like what goes into kind of the, not just the forefront, but also the, kind of the anchor of the image or the writing or anything like that?
Well, I always felt like the images or the people that I painted, for the viewer, I wanted them to have this really intimate personal experience. And I felt like if I placed them anywhere, that it would change the context of who they are, or how you interpret who they are. And I studied with Odd Nerdrum for a summer in Larvik, Norway, and he spoke about work, and I think it can be any kind of work, writing or photography or whatever, of images being heliocentric and geocentric. And he kind of stretched the definition of the words, but he said that like geocentric work, you have to be present and alive during that time to be able to understand it and to connect to it. So for example, Andy Warhol's Brillo box. But then he showed us these two landscapes that were painted by two different artists. And one of them was alive and one of them wasn't. And it was the strangest thing I've ever seen, but when I saw that, I realized that those are the kind of paintings that I wanted to make. So I feel as if them existing in these liminal spaces and kind of airy spaces allows them to have a longer shelf life, if you will, to be with you if you saw it 100 years ago or 100 years in the future. But I am moving forward in my studio practice. I made my first painting where I actually placed people outside, so it's not a flat color. But with Michelle's portrait, that blue color, if it had gotten any darker or if it had been a different color, it wouldn't have had the kind of angelic, ephemeral feel that I think that it has. I think that, for example, if I had painted her yellow, it just would have been a wall if the background was yellow, but with that blue, it kind of goes into deep space. And it lifts her up. It kind of billows the dress, and it just builds the energy around her, I think. So, I mean, that's why I made that color choice.
I mean, I feel like in terms of background, to answer your question, that's everything. I don't know. I think what ends up getting produced, feel free to add to that, is so little of what actually is the work. It's not even comes close to being what other people see. The background is all of it. And I was smiling when Amy was presenting the painting that resembled a photograph, having not seen the photograph, because I think that is the background too, is like without even realizing it, you're like prophesizing on work or finding connections and stuff you haven't even seen because you're so immersed in the work and the background and the research and whatever inspires you, and what you actually end up showing is so tiny in comparison.
So it looks like maybe one more question. I think there's a person right here.
So part of my question was actually that question that was just asked, but I have been thinking about high stakes in portraiture, and particularly how you decide, or different types of symbols, or and even thinking about the art history of portraiture and how important it is to imbue the subject with things that talk about their lives off of the canvas or whatever medium you're using. I was wondering about that, if you had any thoughts on those in particular. But I also want to point out for Durga, I really appreciated your description of these images, because I love the idea that we all know that photographs are a cutout of time, but speaking in this imaginary way about these images before and after puts them back into context that I think is really important when we think about photography, especially when you're thinking about representation and the idea of portraiture as something that's imbuing humanity rather than just the idea of representation in and of itself, but this dimensionality that you can give to the subject, however it is. So, however you want to respond to that, but I was also
what was the
thinking
question?
of just this like the high stakes that you bring to your work, in particular for you, Amy, specifically about how you choose to paint the clothing of your subjects, how you choose to, not just the color of the backgrounds, but other things that sort of give us a story about these subjects.
A lot of my models exist in space and time exactly the way that I see them. I don't know if I think about it as high stakes. I don't think, I don't know. I think, in the making of things, I really rely on my intuition. I rely a lot on serendipity. I think that there is, there are stories out there that need to be told. I'm a Black woman. I'm a figurative painter. I'm a Black female figurative painter. And there's a lot of power that I feel like I've been given, to have those, to have the agency to use those tools of agency to kind of make the images ubiquitous and put them out into these spaces. And I think I'm so caught up in the pushing that I don't really think about anything else. Like it's like passing out flyers. Like I just want to get as many out as I possibly can. And then 20 years from now, I'll look back at like the NAACP Image Awards when I'm getting my award for painting Michelle. And I'd be like, look what then I'll think of it. But I feel like life moves too fast. Honestly, for me, like I need some time though, really, because I'm really busy. But life it's moving too fast for me to think about it. And I feel like for every image that I make, there's a negative one that's being born at the same time. So it's like a constant reflux of trying to fit myself into, for one, the genre of American realism, and into the pantheon of painters that are white men. So I'm thinking about that a lot. Yeah. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you everyone for coming, and there is a reception that follows.